I want to welcome our guest speaker for this week. We have Dr. Sarah de los Santos Upton. She is the scholar who wrote 2 of the 3 articles or the readings that we have for this week. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to go ahead and get into this. I know you have a lot going on and we're all working from home and you got 2 little ones over there. So let's just start with a basic question. So in your own words, what is Ansaldua's concept of Nepantla?
So Nepantla is really the term that Ansaldua uses for describing this kind of in-between space. So I think for us, who many of us are living here, I know that some students are probably coming into the class remotely from other places, but for those of us who live here on the Mexico-US border, that's a perfect representation of what she's talking about as Nepantla. So it's an in-between space. And within these kinds of in-between spaces, we question our identities break down, we rebuild them in different ways. However, not everybody who lives in border spaces chooses to embrace Nepantlismo. So this is a choice that we make if we want to engage in this kind of identity work. However, when we make this choice, it's not always easy. We might experience arrebatamientos or ruptures in our identities, which necessitate what Ansaldua calls the Coyle-Schalke imperative, or the process of kind of pulling ourselves back together again. And through this process, we become experienced in nagualismo or shape-shifting as we morph in and out of different aspects of our identity, depending on the situation that we may find ourselves in at the time. And we ultimately seek out el árbol de la vida, or the tree of life, which Ansaldua uses as a metaphor to think about the way that we collectively create our identities with our cultures, our ancestors, and our environments. And for me, Nepantlismo is alive and well on the border, especially for the students who I work with at UTEP, because they've really showed me that through their embrace of Nepantlismo, that it's not just a concept in a book that Ansaldua wrote about. It's actually something that these students bring into our classrooms and into our communities, and they really embody this idea of conocimiento that Ansaldua talks about, which is a transformative way of thinking that kind of draws on almost on our sixth sense and our mestiza consciousness to create meaningful change and meaningful ways of living in the world. So Nepantla, just to kind of summarize, is an in-between space, but it's this space where this really powerful, identity work and activist work takes place.
Okay. And, one thing that I thought was really interesting, you discussed the notion that there's this complicated balance between like a pursuit of pan-Latino identity, but also a recognition that like Latina, Latino, Latinx identity cannot and should not be essentialized. But that only further highlights like the complicated nature of mestizaje and hybrid identity. That said, you discuss you bring in a lot of scholars. You bring, Calafel, Pineda, Deschênes, and you discuss the performance of this identity as a type of journey. That said, what are some of the characteristics of that journey?
So I would love the opportunity to highlight the work of Richard Pineda, who's the chair of the communication department at the University of Texas at El Paso. And so he is really the person who's writing about this process of, specifically for him, it's the performance of Chicana-Chicano identity is kind of a journey, much like crossing the border. So I'd love to just share a quote from this article that he wrote that I also cite in the Communicating Nepantla chapter. So he explains that, quote, "To journey is a process rather than a one-time event. There is a struggle that goes on as identity becomes and changes, in the same way that the journey encompasses struggle. For Mexican Americans, whether or not they themselves crossed the border, or if their families and ancestors before them made the trek, or even if the border demarcating the United States from Mexico changed around them. The journey is an important part of mestizo identity. And so I think that kind of summarizes this idea that identity is complicated.
Right.
Not especially, all identities are complicated. And for people who are experiencing mestizo identities, hybrid identities, I think that this idea of journey is really important because it's not work that's ever done. You never get to a place where you're like, okay, I figured out my identity, I'm done. This is a lifelong process. And as you experience different issues that come up in your life, different moments, different changes, transitions, you're going to have to refigure out your identity continuously for your whole life. So it's this kind of, a journey is a great metaphor for thinking about identity because it's a process that will unfold for our entire lives.
I think it's interesting because you and I have had personal conversations about living in El Paso and kind of like the kind of bubble that we get to live in here. And it's like this really comfortable space. And then the second you leave for an extended period of time, you have to come to terms with like the different, you might have had your own identity that you kind of grabbed onto by yourself. Like, this is my ascribed identity. And then you have no control over what other people are going to throw onto you once you leave El Paso and leave the borderland. That said, so in your article, because I think it kind of segues pretty nicely here. So in your article, you mentioned that the work of Nepantleras is often to untangle our identities from the labels and stereotypes forced upon us, continuously constructing identities in the cracks between worlds. That said, how have you seen that work play out in the journey of your own personal career?
So this is an excellent question and a tough one, but in a good way. I think that you and I have both had experiences in graduate school with professors. One particular professor comes to mind, and I won't name any names, but in a course about culture and about identity, where we were told, oh, your borderland perspective makes no sense. You don't know how to study culture correctly and we were kind of treated as though our perspective was deficient. It was lacking something. It didn't align with this norm that the professor was looking for in her own study of identity. And so I think that we experience academia coming from these marginalized positions, coming from border spaces, with people telling us, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, or this cultural knowledge that you're bringing to the table isn't valid, it's not real. And I think that having to do the work to untangle this idea that, no, my perspective is valid, there is something to learn about identity through looking at hybrid identities and borderland perspectives. And I think that having to, that was a huge struggle in grad school, to have to continually push back against people who didn't take me seriously and didn't see my perspective as valid. But having to do that work helped me reaffirm to myself that there is much to learn from these perspectives on identity. They take us further than these kind of dominant or traditional approaches to identity in the field of communication do. And I think that the way that that's played out in my own career is that it has pushed me to have to really think, to be really, really thoughtful and intentional about the way that I'm teaching identity, the way that I'm writing about identity. I've had to defend my work maybe in ways that some of my peers didn't have to in grad school, but that really set me up to know who I am as a scholar, who I want to be as a professor, how to affirm the identities of other students from marginalized positions and really see them bringing this knowledge to the classroom as an asset rather than a deficit. And I think that it's created a much richer classroom experience for all of us. And then I think that it's helped me on a personal, individual level figure out who I am as a scholar and who I want to be and what I want to do. Does that answer your question?
That was perfect. And I think that helps kind of push into the next question, because, this is the course we're in right now is the leadership on the border. And I know for a lot of the first few weeks, we've been focusing on just kind of describing the people and the culture and just the contributions of folks who live along the border and the folks that are even, the contributions of folks from Mexico. But there's also been this kind of conversation I've talked about in terms of like, for people who move to the borderline and have no idea what it's all about, like what to expect. That said, the majority of the people, at least here in El Paso and other major border cities, often the people in leadership positions are from those areas, right? And so for yourself, my question for you is, a lot of Nepantleras enter leadership positions, whether it's corporate world, nonprofit, academia, and you yourself have found success, obviously, in academia. So how has your journey affected your approach to leadership, whether it's in the classroom, through scholarship? How is the journey that you've described already, how has that affected your approach to leadership?
I think that one of my favorite parts about, being born and raised in El Paso and going to school at UTEP and continuing to be lucky enough to live here and teach here is this idea that Anzaldúa talks about how when we exist in these in-between spaces that we have to develop a tolerance for ambiguity, because if not, it's just going to be incredibly confusing to move about the world in our everyday lives. And I remember, being a child and recognizing that in-betweenness, knowing that in 5 minutes, we could be in a different country, and that makes complete sense to me. And then when I moved away from the border, thinking about how it felt so strange to not be on the border of two cultures and languages and countries. And so I bring this up because I think that the tolerance for ambiguity allows us to be leaders in really powerful ways that are different from what we traditionally think of as leadership. So I think that we can accept that multiple perspectives are valid and true and have something to bring to the table. It opens us up to that instead of thinking there's one right way to do something, there's one solution to a problem, there's one approach, there's one truth. We know that the world is more complicated than that because we live in that complicated space every day. And so I think that it affects leadership because we can think about multiple different kinds of solutions to problems. We are willing to welcome multiple diverse perspectives into, accomplishing a task or a goal. And I think that is, instead of feeling like I'm in charge, it's all on me, I have to make the one correct decision by myself, I think that it creates this collaboration that is kind of uniquely grounded in Nepantla, to be able to affirm and open yourself up to multiple ways of thinking, of living, of accomplishing whatever goal or task you have for your organization.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, it makes sense. And I think the other thing I was thinking about is we talk about, or I think you've talked about before with me, like the fact that living in that space, you kind of live in the gray, right? You understand that things aren't just black and white because like it just can't be, right? Especially when you, I know you and I have had conversations just in terms of like our own home lives, where it is like oftentimes like a clashing of cultures that you have to live in. Like you live in that gray at all times. And so once you reach a leadership position, I think for me, it's made it much easier to understand that there isn't one right way of doing things. And oftentimes my way of thinking things are going to be right isn't not necessarily the case, where the more fruitful and beneficial solution is going to come from the in-between of bringing in all these different ideas together. Absolutely. So I think that That kind of leads me into the next question, where you talk about when for many for Nepaleras or mestizas in leadership roles, you talk about the critical work of coalition. So can you explain like that role and maybe some examples of coalition?
Absolutely. And so I encourage you and your students to look at the work of Dr. Karma Chavez, who is at University of Texas at Austin. She has some really incredible work on coalition building and how important it is for activist work specifically. And she's talking about kind of the intersections between movements for LGBTQ rights and movements for migrant rights, and how those are intertwined. And the only way to move forward to achieve particular goals is for leaders from those movements to come together and work together to build coalitions. And so building off of her work, Dr. Leandra Hernandez from Utah Valley University and I have written a lot about how we have to have coalition building around issues that may not immediately seem like they're intertwined. So, for example, reproductive justice and migrant rights. And I think that most people, if they don't live in a border space, might think that those two things are unrelated. But living here, being here every day, we recognize that people in our community are uniquely impacted by barriers to reproductive justice. Children who are being held in detention centers. We need to look at that from a migrant right perspective, but it's also a reproductive justice issue. And so if we, instead of keeping those two movements separate and assuming that they have separate goals, if we can work together to accomplish those goals that we have in common, I think that that's a different way to lead than to say, I'm the person who has knowledge about this issue. I know what's right to do. I can figure it out myself. And my organization, we're the ones who are gonna, come and fix this problem. I think that there's a lot of power in saying, we know part of it, we know a piece of it, but we can work together with these other organizations, these other leaders. And through building that coalition, we have a much better chance of creating sustainable solutions that are unique to the problem at hand in ways that we couldn't accomplish on our own individually.
Okay. And lastly, this is kind of a heavy question, or kind of a multi-layered question, but many of the students that are taking this course, they're taking it because they are from the border, they love the border, they want to continue the work of nurturing the borderland, but also understand that despite the demographics of the borderland, they often have to deal with the hegemonic power structures that prioritize whiteness and heteronormativity and patriarchal perspectives. So what advice would you give for other mestizajes and nepantleras who are currently or aspire to be in a leadership position for dealing with their own journey navigating all of these factors?
That is an incredibly complicated question. And I mean, you look at the leadership in El Paso historically, and it does not represent accurately what the community looks like, and the demographics don't line up, right? And I think that it's important to I talked a little bit earlier about this idea that the knowledge that we're bringing to the table is not a deficit. It is a gift, and it is a unique form of knowledge that you can't learn from a book. Ruth Trinidad Galvan, who was a professor at University of New Mexico, used to write a lot about the things that we learn at the kitchen table. So the kitchen table is a valid site of knowledge building, and we learn things from our abuelas, our tias, sitting at these kitchen tables. They give us tools to go out and do important, meaningful things in the world around us. And then I think that we get, into academia, unfortunately, a lot of the time, we come into these classes and we're told like, none of that matters. None of what you learned at your kitchen table matters. Read this book, regurgitate what is talked about in this book. And that's what really matters. So I think that an important part of leadership, especially in our community, is to know that your roots in this community matter. Your knowledge that you learned maybe in a class, maybe in other ways of, there are other ways that we learn that don't always take place in a classroom, and those are valid. And so you're bringing this depth of experience that is meaningful and important and powerful, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise, and don't let anybody minimize that or take that away from you. And I think that we have to continue to seek out leadership positions in the community, so that we can, there needs to be, like I said before, more of a reflection of who we are as a community in the leadership. So that could be political leadership. That could be, we're starting to have more business opportunities for people who are born and raised in this community. And then they're doing really cool things like, just as an example, I know that the Fab Lab has been making 3D printing equipment that care providers need during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's leadership. That is somebody leaving the community to maybe study elsewhere and bringing knowledge back into the community and figuring out something's missing. There's something that we're not getting. What can we do together to make it happen, to figure it out for ourselves, without waiting for the government that's frankly not helping us in this moment, rather than waiting for them to come bail us out of this problem. What can we do as a community to come up with a creative solution together? And I think that's leadership. That,
right.
I think it involves creativity. The Pantleras are uniquely positioned to be able to tap into that way of thinking that gets us kind of out of the box solutions for problems. And I think that it's important to think about that in this moment, especially. Things are crazy. We're having to figure out new ways of doing everything in our daily lives. But there is a space for coming up with creative solutions to problems. And I think, again, coalition building, thinking about it in from a community perspective rather than just an individual perspective, can help us think about, here's a need that's not being met, and I have a particular knowledge set, but who else has skills and knowledge that we can work together and build upon to fill this gap that we have or address some need in the community. And I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was just the first example that came to mind. But when we were studying in Albuquerque for our PhDs, I worked with a community that tried to figure out, well, we don't have access to healthcare, but fighting the system and trying to get access to healthcare through these traditional channels is going to take a lot of time, and we may not have that time. So what can we do instead? We can build our own health clinic. And that's what people did in the International District of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so I think that there's so many opportunities in these border spaces to come up with creative solutions that don't fit necessarily into the traditional way of doing something. And that is really an area where leadership can flourish, in my opinion.
Perfect. Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time and speaking to my class and hanging out with me.
It was so nice. I wish I could actually be in the classroom with you all, but one day.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.